Hey, what's up guys? My name is Cameron Gallagher from We Are Film, and today we're talking some vintage lenses. So, let's get into it. So vintage lenses are one of the easiest and cheapest ways to buy very high quality lenses that kind of give any digital sensor a very different look. Now, I've used some vintage lenses in the past, but one of the films that really got me interested in this was actually our recent short film where our DP Josh brought some vintage Contax lenses from Zeiss. And these things looked incredible, and I was just blown away by the character that it gave to my Ursa Mini Pro. Now, I've used the Ursa Mini Pro on a ton of projects with my Sigma lenses and Canon lenses, and one of the things that I love most about the camera is, of course, how high quality the sensor is. So you have this incredible high quality sensor, but one of the things is sometimes it becomes a little bit too digital. Now, I've talked about some filters in the front, that you can use on front of the lens to sort of make it a little more vintage and filmic, in this case, the Dream FX filter that I've been using. But one of the other easy ways to create a more vintage and sort of character, or I guess bring that character to your digital sensor, is by using vintage lenses. And the reason being is because vintage lenses are actually altering the way that the light is being captured. Because remember, a sensor in all cameras, whether they're film or digital, is still light being captured by this sensor. Now, of course, the way that light is interpreted is through the lens. So having a lens that has some older characteristics, maybe the way that it flares or the way that it actually enhances that light, or the coatings, or maybe the actual spheres inside or spherical lens pieces, and it would alter the way the light is coming through the lens and into the camera sensor, can really have a huge impact. Now, one of the great things about vintage lenses is that they are incredibly cheap too. And this is one of the reasons why I really recommend them. So you can go on eBay or you go on Amazon or pretty much anywhere and find these vintage lenses. One of the most popular are actually the Canon FD series. Now, the reason why these are so popular is because they were actually the lenses made for the old Canon film cameras. So right here, I think is my Canon AE1. I think it's the AE1, right? So this is my film camera, the Canon AE1, and the original lens that came with this was the Canon 50mm FD. Now, FD is the actual Canon mount. That's the old film mount. Obviously, the new one is the EF, and they also have the R, I believe. But these are old film camera lenses. These were made through about the 80s, I believe, and maybe possibly into the 90s, but they're really high quality glass that are pretty fast. Most of them are 2.8, but actually this guy, the 50, is 1.8, and they have a very big range of focal lengths, and the thing is, they're incredibly easy to find because there was a ton of them. So most of these lenses you can find anywhere from like 40, maybe even less, to like $80 or $90. So what I did is I actually picked up the Canon FD 24mm, the Canon FD 35mm. I have the Canon 50mm that I got with the film camera. And I also have the Helios 44-2, which is I think a 58mm lens. And this is a vintage Russian lens, so it's a little different, but kind of a similar idea. Now, right out of the gate, these vintage lenses look awesome. You slap on your camera and they look incredible. The image, the way that the flares, the quality to these lenses are just so nice, and I think it kind of helps take that digital edge off a digital sensor. So for me, the visual quality is incredible, but there's a little bit of a problem. These are not the easiest lenses to work with because of a couple of reasons. First off, they're different mounts, so you have to adapt those, right? And it's, well, what kind of mount is going to be good or actually going to work? The other thing is none of the filter sizes match up because they're all incredibly small. And these are also very small lenses. Now, I will say one of the problems that I have not been able to solve is the size of these lenses. Now, if you look at some of these lenses, this is the Helios and this is the Canon, I believe this is the 24. And even with the mount that I've adapted, which we'll talk about in a second, they're very short lenses. So the problem is getting a follow focus on here is kind of impossible because you wouldn't have enough room to actually put a follow focus on. Now, if you're using electronic follow focus like a Nucleus M or something like that, or Nucleus Nano, you might be able to do that, but in this case, unfortunately, really haven't solved the focus issue. You just kind of have to use them manually. So that's what it is. But one of the obvious ones that you can see right now is I actually did change out all of the front diameters. So what I did was I adapted all of the diameters from, I think they're 58 or 52, most of them, to the 77mm thread. Now, you could go 82, but I do find that a lot of 82mm filters are way more expensive. And if you're using most of these anyway, the 77mm is much cheaper and much easier to find. So what I did was I bought a bunch of step-up rings to adapt all of these, and I also bought a bunch of the Manfrotto zoom lenses. So this is the magnetic kit. So it allows for all of my filters to magnetically pop on and off, so the caps, and of course the filters that I use can all be adapted to each one of these lenses. So that's super handy because then I have all magnetic lenses, I can use all of my filters on them quick and easily, and they all have the same front diameter. This also would make it a lot easier if you're using a matte box. I'm not personally, but again, it would make it quite a bit easier. But let's talk about the big thing, and this is adapting these lenses, because the problem with these lenses is, of course, they're FD, And actually, I believe in the Helios, I think it's a C mount, which I think is a CCTV. I could be wrong on that, but I know it is a different mount that's not very typical. Now with the Helios, my recommendation is try to find one that's already adapted for EF. Way easier, it's just much simpler, and it's just the easier way to go. Now with the Canon FD lenses, it's a lot easier to actually find these mounts and put them on your camera, but the problem is that I did actually buy a mount and it was garbage, it didn't work. The flange distance was not the same, it wasn't correct. So I found one that I want to highly recommend, and I'll tell you one of the reasons why it's so important. But let's talk about our sponsor first. So I want to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this episode and been sponsoring us for the last couple months here. I've been super excited that they have come on as a sponsor because Skillshare is a massive, just awesome community of creatives teaching other creatives. Now, if you don't know what Skillshare is, it's basically a website where there's a ton of different just content and information all across the board, from filmmaking to photography to web design to graphic design to painting to drawing to business. I mean, literally, it is basically endless as to what they have. And all of these experiences are made by creatives, and that's one of my favorite parts about it. Is this is not just somebody teaching you something who's never done this. These are actual people out there doing this stuff every single day. So it's a great way to brush up on old skills or to learn new skills. Maybe you want to reach out into a new business or you want to try new things. Skillshare is the perfect place to not only try new things, but polish those old skills that you already have, or just for entertainment value. I don't think people talk about this enough, but on Skillshare, there's a lot of just interesting content. Even if you maybe already know that content, just the way that it's presented could put you in a new mindset or give you a big creative boost. And sometimes that's all you need. I've been loving some of the photography ones recently, been diving in and kind of looking at some different ways of using photography, not only to just be a better photographer, but also to bring that to my cinematography and also to my storytelling in general. How can I help use the frame to tell more stories? And of course, that's the great thing about Skillshare, is you can branch out and do new things, so I've been super happy. So the first 1,000 people to use the link in the description below will get a trial of the Skillshare premium membership, and then after that, it's about 10 bucks a month, so it's like super cheap. So definitely check out that link down in the description below and also in the pinned comment, because again, the first 1,000 people get that, so go hop on that, that's amazing. So I've been super excited with all the experiences and all the things that I've learned on Skillshare. So join the community with us, and yeah, we'll see you there. And a huge thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this episode. So let's talk adapters. So one of the adapters that I found that I was super impressed with was this one called Velo. Now this is the Canon FD lens to Canon EOS. So of course this is gonna adapt my Canon FD lenses to my actual Canon EOS or the EF mount. Now the thing about these adapters, and one of the things about these lenses, is these are made for both manual and automatic use. Not automatic in the sense of focus, but the automatic f-stop. So for instance, if you had a film camera like I do, the AE1, you could actually set this to manual and use this with a manual aperture. Now the problem is that the mechanism inside has to be clicked on in order to open that up and then create a manual actual f-stop ring. So that way when you turn the f-stop ring, it actually changes the f-stop. Where before, if you had this just with a dummy adapter or something that was kind of passive, you're going to just connect this adapter and it's going to do nothing. Now I don't know if you can see this right now, and I'll probably get a different shot, but because of this, there's a little button on the side and you can lock and unlock or open and close this manual switch to use on these Canon FD lenses. So now, as you can see, when I open and close this, so you can probably see as I open and close this, it is opening and closing those aperture rings. Whereas if I were to close this, and I'm not gonna do that because it's really annoying, but once you do that, then of course it's not going to work because it's only gonna be waiting for the camera to send the information over, which obviously our camera is not. So that's one of the biggest reasons why you wanna buy a good lens adapter for these lenses, because if you don't, it may not even work. And again, the first dummy one I had, the passive one, didn't work at all. So I'm gonna leave the link in the description for this Velo one. This one was really, I mean, it's not the cheapest thing in the world, it's like 30 bucks. So granted, it adds up a little bit, but when you think about kitting out a couple of these vintage lenses, I mean, you're talking it's still way cheaper. My Canon 135 was around 1,000 or 1,200 when I first bought it. And I have kitted out pretty much all of these vintage lenses with these adapters and all these lens fronts and pretty much everything for under like a couple $100. So when you look at it in the scheme of things, you're getting an incredibly awesome image, something that has a true character and just a very like vintage, but not vintage in a bad way, like an old school way, but it just, again, captures light differently. And you're getting that for cheaper than one lens cost that's modern. Now there is some disadvantages to using these vintage lenses, and it kind of depends on how you're using them. For instance, if I was shooting a very clinical medical video, maybe it's about a doctor's office or something, or a hospital, I probably wouldn't use the vintage lenses because they have a not dirty look to them, but they have sort of an imperfect look to them. In something like a doctor's office or something that's very clean and clinical, you want to show off sort of the quality and the precise and the precision and the cleanness and the sharp edges of everything. Same thing with like a beer commercial or a product commercial. You may not want to use vintage lenses. Now maybe you do for a certain reason, but you may not want to because you may want to show the sharpest part of each image and you want the beer to be perfectly crisp and the bottle to be super sharp, because these lenses are not insanely sharp. And I think that really works for something like an Ursa Mini Pro G2 like I have, because the digital image sensor is huge and has a massive high resolution. So when I have 4.6K, and you're using vintage lenses, well, yeah, maybe it's a little, unsharp in the scheme of things. Maybe it's not as sharp as my Sigma or Canon glass, but you have an incredibly high resolution sensor, so it's gonna look good. The downside is I probably wouldn't put these on a very cheap camera. So like right now I'm using the Panasonic G7, which is a great camera for just this. It's just me talking, it's easy. I wouldn't use vintage lenses on it because yes, you could adapt them and yes, it would work. But the problem is that although this has a 4K sensor, it is it's not as good as the 4.6K sensor, obviously in the Ursa Mini Pro G2. Even the GH5, when I did use vintage lenses, didn't look as nice as I would hope, where something like the Ursa Mini Pro or like an ARRI Alexa or a Red or a Sony, one of those newer Sonys, I can't remember their names now, or some of the Sony Venice lines, these are incredibly high-end cameras, so putting vintage lenses on those, yes, are degrading the quality in a little bit or a slight sense, but again, you're degrading an incredibly high, detailed image sensor, so it's fine. But when you're working with a smaller sensor or a sensor that's not as high quality, less dynamic range, you probably don't want to put this on there because it's going to make the image look slightly worse, which again, isn't a bad thing, but when you're working with a lower sort of threshold anyway, it's going to just make it look that much worse. Maybe your focus won't look as good. And I would say if you're using like a DSLR, like a Canon, T5i or any of those types of cameras, I definitely wouldn't use it because I do think, although it may have a cool look to it, I think it's gonna degrade the image too much and it's gonna just take away from it. So again, I kind of give you this like, they're amazing and they look incredible, but again, I would use them on a nicer camera or a higher end sensor, because using them on a cheaper camera, although you get a similar look, it may just make the entire thing look a little too cheap. But overall, they're an incredible buy, and I will say it's one of the easiest way to buy lenses to get into it. So for instance, let's say you do have a cheaper camera and you're just getting into filmmaking, you don't have much money, I would recommend, hey, go buy some vintage lenses, because guess what? You can have those vintage lenses and they may not be amazing for with your camera right now, but in the future when you upgrade, you can still keep these lenses, because think about it. These are like 30, 40, 50 years old, some of these, and they still look amazing. So if they're 30, 40, 50 years old right now and they still work amazing, they're at least gonna work for the next 5, 10, 15 years for you and whoever else you bring on in the future. So I do think that having vintage lenses is a cheap and easy way to get incredible quality. And honestly, I have been incredibly impressed. And the cool thing is there's not much risk to it, because even if you don't like them, maybe it's not your bag, you spent 40 bucks, you spent 50 bucks. You didn't spend $600, $700, or $1,000 or more for a lens. And if they break, you can go buy another one for cheaper. So that's the other great part, is if I'm on set and I smash this lens for whatever reason, I wouldn't, but if I did, at least I know I can go replace this for $100 or less. I don't have to then go and make an insurance claim or go out and fully buy out another $600, $700, $800 lens. The only thing I wish I could figure out is, again, the size. I wish they were just a little bit longer so that you could easily use a follow focus. So if anyone has any ideas on how to do that, that would be awesome. Let me know down in the comments below, because I think if I could solve that, they would be pretty incredible, and I could install the actual focus gears on them full time, and that would be awesome. But again, I don't have any ideas yet, so if you guys have any, be sure to let me know down in the comments. Also, stay tuned, I have some really cool videos coming soon. We actually just picked up a glide gear dolly. Super excited to talk about that, because I think it's an underrated piece of gear that people just don't talk about, unfortunately, anymore. So anyway, guys, thanks for watching as always. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys later.